Hey, out of curiosity, how many of you guys already have your Christmas decorations up? Show of hands. Awesome. Good for you guys. Ushers, can we escort them all out? I have neighbors who worked hard all day yesterday. They put up all their lights, big wreaths, all the light animals in the front yard, made me feel wholly inadequate for existing. And I went back, said, I'm going to put up some lights. And I put a string up on our back patio cover and then went inside because I was tired. Anybody else with me on this? I'm not ready for this yet, but we're so many that are already done, and it does nothing but make us aware of how inadequate we are. And I say this because this morning, we may have the same kind of dynamic happening to an extent. I wish that on Sunday mornings, every single Sunday, we could just come in. I could just let everybody know how wonderful everything is. You guys are doing such a great job. I'm doing a great job. We're all just great. And then we can leave and go get in and out, and everything's perfect in the world. Woo! No, because there are times where we come here and we open this and just ruins all of our fun. Because God has something to say, and there's things that we need to change. We have been studying through the book of Nehemiah, and if you're just joining us, you have wonderful timing. We're finishing today. And I want to encourage you to hop online, listen to some of the messages from previous weeks, because there's a lot that you don't want to miss out on. The series is called Built for This, A Life That Matters. And we've been talking together about each and every one of us, how there's something in us that wants our life to count. We want to live a life of eternal significance where our life echoes into eternity. Anybody with me on that? Where it matters and there's importance and significance to it. Unfortunately, we can't do it on our own. A life that matters comes from responding to a calling that matters, and that calling only comes from God. And so this series has been about learning together what that calling looks like, how He has a special, a unique plan and purpose to use each and every one of you for His purposes that last forever. That's what this series has been about. Today we're bringing it home, and if you want a primary theme that we're going to be studying together, feel free to write this down. Here's what we're going to be talking about today. A life that matters is lived God's way. Not our way, not the way of the world. A life of eternal significance is lived God's way. Now, why are we going to talk about some unsettling and possibly challenging things this morning? Because I believe with all of my heart that each of us can fall into a trap, and may be there right now, where we are trying to live a life that matters, but we're trying to do it our own way. We're trying to do it with our plans and our path instead of submitting our lives to the plan and purpose of God. Now, before we dive into Nehemiah 13, let me set some of the background here. As we know, Nehemiah, this man, a Jew living in Persia, was called by God to head back to his homeland in Jerusalem and to rebuild the wall around the city of Jerusalem so that God's people who had returned from their exile in Babylon and Persia, and the city had been destroyed, so they could live in safety and rebuild the city of God. That was Nehemiah's call. He was obedient, went and rebuilt the wall, and then he began to see all of the different problems in the land of Israel. And he started making social reforms and spiritual reforms and trying to make things right. And here we're coming into this last chapter. And the assumption, as we're going to see, is that Nehemiah has now been back in Persia for some time. That as he promised the king, he was only in Israel for a season. He returned, was doing his job for several years, and now he gets permission from the king to return to Jerusalem and see how things are going. To see specifically if the people of God were faithful to the commitments that they had made to God. You think they were? Man, you guys know human nature. Absolutely not. What we see in this whole story and what we're about to read is that the people had already violated this incredible covenant they made with their Creator. And before we judge, I think it's important to recognize we do the same thing over and over and over again, don't we? Even as followers of Christ, so many commitments that we make, yet there seems to be something in us that pulls us toward living our own life the way we want to. That pulls us towards saying, you know what, I know God says this, and this is what He wants from me as His child. But maybe He didn't factor in this situation. Maybe there's certain things that will make what I'm about to do okay. It's like driving a car that's out of alignment. You ever had alignment problems in your vehicle? You know, you'd like to just take your hands off the steering wheel, and a car with perfect alignment just keeps going straight right where it was headed. But you got a car that's out of alignment, you let go of that steering wheel, and what happens? You go out the road. It is a constant battle where you're having to hold it in place. So often that's the Christian life, isn't it? But we're constantly fighting this gravitational pull of sin and our rebellious nature. And we're not alone. The Apostle Paul wrote often about it. Galatians 5:17, he says it this way: "For the desires of the flesh," that's our sinful tendency and natures, "they are against the Spirit of God. And the desires of the Spirit are against the what? The flesh. These are opposed to each other to keep you from doing the things you want to do." Paul says each of us is a rope in a massive tug-of-war between the flesh and the Spirit. And we need to recognize that tendency to live apart from God. So how do we respond? How do we deal with these sinful influences that pull us away from Him? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Nehemiah chapter 13, I'm going to start reading in verse 1. Everybody there? If not, you can follow along up on the screen as well. "On that day, they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people. And in it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. For they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing." This is a historical account of the Ammonites and Moabites wanting destruction and death for the people of Israel. Verse 3, "As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. Now before this, Eliashib, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah," Tobiah was an Ammonite, "prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering, the frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I," Nehemiah speaking here, "was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king. And after some time I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem." The insinuation is came back to Jerusalem. "And I then discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber." That'll show him. Verse 9, "Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God with the grain offering and the frankincense." Let me pause here just for a minute. Now, who is this Tobiah character? Tobiah, as we read in previous chapters, was the son-in-law of Eliashib, the high priest of God's people at the time. You see the problem with this? God had given a command that no Ammonite, no Moabite, no foreigner who was an enemy of the people of God were permitted into the community and life of the people of God. And not only did they not respect this command of God and honor it, the very high priest allowed his daughter, his child, to marry with an Ammonite by the name of Tobiah. Tobiah is a picture, a type, or a representation of this world, of those who are not of the people of God, of the system of sinful influences that pulls us away from God and intimacy with Him. The world is all around us. You ever seen the movie The Matrix? The world is the Matrix. And guys, we are plugged in. You turn on the news, you click on websites, you see it everywhere. You just listen to conversation. Go into Starbucks and just listen to people. Listen to their conversation, the things that they're talking about and mulling over, and what is okay and not okay for them. And you see the influence of this system of the world. And it has infiltrated the church as well. And yet as the people of God, we need to respond as they did and bring a separation to say we are of God, not of this world. These foreigners were historically enemies of Israel who wanted to destroy God's people. Sin is destructive. Now, if you are young and in here today, you may not fully grasp the destructive nature of sin. Maybe you dabble with it a little bit and do certain things you know are wrong, but no big deal, and you manage to kind of correct your course and make things okay. But if you're an old geezer like me, if you've been around this life long enough, you know the destructive potential of sin, don't you? You know that when we walk our own path and not the path of God's purpose and blessing in our lives, we bring hurt and harm to ourselves and to those we love and care about most. And it is only God's grace that allows there to be not only reparation, but restoration of the things that sin has taken from us. Sin destroys. It brings death and harm. This is why Jesus, throughout the Gospels, would make statements that if you just read them in an isolated context would seem so extreme. But when you understand how harmful sin is, it makes perfect sense. Look with me in Matthew 18, verse 8. Jesus says this, "If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life crippled or lame than with 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into the eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, do what? Tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life with 1 eye than with 2 eyes to be thrown into the hell of fire." Now, if we took this literally, let's be honest, we would be handing out prosthetics and eye patches at the door today. What is Jesus communicating? He is emphasizing how destructive sin is, that it is not something to be messed with, let alone to be invited to take residence in our lives. Just like Tobiah, how Eliashib not only allowed him in the community and fellowship of the people of God, this enemy of God and his people, but he invited him in and gave him residence in the very house of God itself. God has established boundaries in his word to protect us. But the fact is, because of our sinful, rebellious nature, we don't like restrictions because we're prideful and we're stubborn. And if someone tells us to do something, oh really? Well, I'll show you who I am. You say left, I'm going to go right. Even if I was planning to go left, no, I'm going right. Because of pride. And because of this sinful nature. Rules and God's restrictions, his boundaries are not there to ruin our fun. Guys, this is not God's plan to destroy every shred of happiness in our world. His goal is not to make you a monk or a nun. His goal is not to turn you Amish, where you churn your own butter and ride in a carriage and buggy. God's goal is to give you life. He is the author and the architect, and he gave us this to say, you want life of not only eternal, but life abundant? You want joy and hope and peace and love and everything good that this life has to offer? Guys, I made it. Here's how you live it. This is his plan for our blessing and our purpose, and yet we treat him as this cosmic killjoy trying to ruin our fun. There are actual laws within cities, counties, even within states, still on the books today, and they're quite amusing to read through as you see them and go, what is this law about? For example, in Anchorage, Alaska, it is a law where bear wrestling matches are prohibited. Also in Alaska, Fairbanks, it is illegal to feed alcoholic beverages to a moose. In California, it is still illegal to be blindfolded while operating a vehicle. Also in California, it is illegal to stab yourself to gain someone else's pity. Wow. But my personal favorite, in Chico, California, it is illegal to detonate a nuclear weapon within city limits. The best part is anyone caught doing so will be fined $500. Now here's the crazy thing. You read these laws, they seem absurd, don't they? But what's crazier? The law, or the fact that at some point in time, it was necessary. At some point in time, the mayor of Anchorage, Alaska said, guys, don't wrestle bears. You're gonna get hurt. You're going to get harmed. Don't get a moose drunk. He will stab you. Don't stab yourself. They're not worth it. We had to create laws to keep people from doing what seems obvious not to do. God's boundaries are there for our benefit and our protection. I want to make sure that we understand something on the flip side of this before we continue. Because as we talk about living our lives God's way, of submitting ourselves to obeying his word, of being different from the world, of living as God has called us to live, we need to beware of legalism. We need to beware of religious performance and pretense and religious conformity, where it's all about the external and the superficial, and we're no longer dealing with God's law and his heart for us. We're now dealing with our own man-made rules and restrictions that we equate to the law of God. And it's our preference. Why? Because people who don't look like us, talk like us, seem like us, make us uncomfortable. And so someone can come in and they are broken, they are a wreck, they have made a mess of their life, and they don't look or act or think like us at all. But they are here because they're finally at a place of saying, my life is upside down and I need God. And I need to be here. And they walk through the doors and we immediately go, oh, who's that? What's their issue? And we want them to become like us. We have no concern about them becoming more like Christ. We start trying to iron out their wrinkles before God has even had a chance to clean them, because we want to save ourselves from being uncomfortable. And so there's this religious performance that's falling off the other side of the horse that is just as much bondage and just as destructive as sin, because it makes us feel that we're doing pretty well. In Ezra chapter 6, we see that even the Ammonites and the Moabites and other foreigners who chose to purify themselves and chose to worship and serve the true and living God were allowed within the community and fellowship of God's people. In fact, when you look at the book of Ruth, a descendant of the Messiah, grandchild, King David, and you have this woman, Ruth, who was a part of all of that. She was a Moabite. And yet God not only included her in the fellowship and community of his people, he included her in the chronology of redemption. That's who God is. And so we're not to write people off and establish our own rules that make us feel more comfortable with situations. There's a group of religious rulers known as the Pharisees who were constantly creating their own boundaries, saying, well, God established this boundary, and we're going to now establish 184 other boundaries to make sure we don't cross that boundary. And it wasn't God's, it was theirs. It was their tradition and their commandment. And then they judged and condemned people who couldn't keep it as well as they could. And they felt very good about themselves. Years ago, we got a 14-foot trampoline for my kids. Anybody else have a death trap at their house? Good stuff. Now the irony here is that my kids have never really hurt themselves, even though it is a death trap for many people. They've done pretty well with this trampoline. But I remember we got it and we first had it and we had this huge net around it, right? The trampoline net. And as a parent, I felt much safer, much better about the fact that at least my children will not fall off and crack their head. But then I started seeing how my children treated the trampoline net. I don't think they understood what it was there for. The net is there just in case, right? But they seemed to think it was like a WWE ring with the ropes, where they could launch themselves into it and spring back onto their siblings or friends and tackle them, and they had a great old time until the net kept tearing over and over and over again, and we had children fall out of the holes in the net. I remember at one point telling my wife, this is ridiculous, I'm taking the net down. Oh, what's going to happen? And parents came over, they judged us. You don't have a net on your trampoline? Like, seriously? When I was growing up, man, my friends had a trampoline. We would take off the front legs and angle the thing, and we would move it in front of the balcony by their pool. We would climb the balcony, jump off, launch off the trampoline into the pool. It was awesome. Minimal brain damage, no big deal. We were fine. So yeah, they're going to be okay without a net. We took the net down. Something crazy happened. All of a sudden, my children, who were UFC fighters one day, and they would get in there and just be all over the place, tearing this thing apart. All of a sudden, my kids, the freedom brought fear. The freedom made them aware. Hold on, there's still another boundary here. You know what the boundary is? The end of the trampoline. And if we go off of it, we may get hurt. We removed the man-made and allowed God's boundary to remain. Guys, as a church, we need to recapture the distinction between our own rules of religion and God's established boundaries from his word. Understand the heart and recapture this so people aren't trying to push up against them in rebellion, but can experience the freedom of the rule and law of God. What did David the psalmist say? God, I delight in your law. I love your commandments. He understood they were for his blessing and benefit. There are some Christians who pride ourselves in what we do and don't do. And we feel so super spiritual. Why? Because other people have problems, but I don't watch those shows. I don't listen to that kind of music. It is pagan. I don't drink alcohol, ever. Those drunkards. And we have this pompous spirituality feeling self-righteous. Now, what does it do? It creates a whole pendulum swing where there's a whole nother group of Christians and believers who react and respond. And they say, well, it's just judgmental and self-righteous. So you know what? I'm going to pride myself and find my Christian identity in my freedom and grace. And so I'm going to watch those movies. I'm going to listen to that music and dance to it. I'm going to get hammered. No, not really, but I'm going to drink. And I'm going to indulge consistently just to show you that I can because we have freedom in Christ. Neither is healthy. Not understanding grace or taking grace and turning it into a license for sin. Guys, we have to understand the heart of God and his commands. To know his will and his desire for us. Galatians chapter 5, Paul writes, verse 4, you are severed from Christ. You who would be justified by the law. You have fallen away from what? From grace. Now we've heard this expression before, haven't we? Oh, so-and-so, they fell from grace. Have you heard that before? How do we use it in today's culture and world? So-and-so fell from grace when they fell from a place and position of righteousness and godliness, and they fell into sin. They fell from grace. Is that how Paul uses it here? It's an biblical expression that is misappropriated in our culture today. Contextually, falling from grace is not falling into sin. It's falling back into religious pretense and performance. It's falling back into a place of saying my dependence for being right with God is not on Christ. It's on how good I am doing, how well I am keeping my own commandments and my own interpretation and understanding of God's word. It's trying to prove how good of a person, how good of a Christian we are by what we do and don't do. I was a youth pastor for almost 10 years, and I remember going through a season that I still look back on and see what God did through it. But I did this whole thing I called the Revolt campaign. It was revolting. There was a revolution component to it. I said, kids, you're called to live differently. God wants you to live for him, and there's so many things that are pulling you away from him. Good start, right? But then I kept going. So listen, here's what we're going to do. I want you guys to bring your movies that you know are not good. I want you to bring your CDs and all the music you have that you know is not good. And I want you to bring your video games that are trash and you know are pulling you away from Lord. In fact, some of you are addicted to it. Bring your whole gaming system. Guys, we're going to take a hammer to them. We're going to break all this stuff up. And we're going to have a holy bonfire of purging. And the kids were like, yeah. And so they brought bags and bags of all this stuff. And we had this time where we threw it all in the fire and the kids were crying and it was great. Now, some of the kids experienced some freedom. It was wonderful. But here's where I failed as their pastor. As I look back, I realized there were so many kids in that time that did these things, not just to be a part of the group and to be included, but they did it thinking that in doing this, they would be a better Christian. That this was their way to be okay with God. That God was going to see what they did and break in their Xbox, break in their DVDs and say, well done, now we're okay. And they didn't understand grace. Removing sinful influences from our lives is not about perfection. It is about our protection. It's about guarding our eyes, our ears, our hearts from things that harm our faith and pull us away from intimacy in a relationship with Christ. So what are the areas of our lives that are easily infiltrated and influenced by this world? This is what we see. Let's keep reading in verse 10. Nehemiah says, I also found out that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them, so that the Levites and the singers who did the work had fled each to his field. So I confronted the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together, set them in their stations. Then all of Judah brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil into the storehouses. Guys, remember, as we just read at the beginning of this chapter, where did Tobiah the Ammonite, the enemy of God and his people, where did he camp out and take up residence? In the storehouse, the room in the temple of God reserved for the offerings and that which God's people gave to him. Money and finance is an area where we are easily influenced by sin in this world. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, when it comes to our money and finances, are we doing it God's way or are we doing it the world's way? What is our standard, and what do we pattern our spending and investing and giving around? God has established a boundary concerning our finances in his word. Oftentimes it's referred to as the tithe, a giving of 10%. Giving to God's house consistently in order to support his work in this world. We've talked in weeks past about the principle of stewardship, understanding that all that we have belongs to him, not just 10%. It's the idea that everything is his, and it's just a matter of how we invest that which he has entrusted to us for a time. Are we spending it on ourselves? Or are we using his money and resources to accomplish his purpose in this world, which is to make disciples? Legalism would say, give 10% of your money and income to God, or he will not be happy with you. And it's religiousness. And it's bondage, and it's not biblical. In fact, it's interesting to me how often we as pastors and church leaders who preach grace and preach freedom from performance with the old covenant law, not to do away with it, but to say that's not how we are right with God in our lives, that it's through Christ and only Christ. And yet when it comes to the giving back to God, it's all about that Old Testament tithe. Why? Because we're afraid. We're afraid if we don't give you a number, you're going to make up your own. And I'm going to give to the Lord, I'm just going to take away a zero, and we'll be okay. We're square. And there's a fear for that. And so as pastors even, we keep preaching 10%, 10%, 10%. If you're only at 8.5%, God is not pleased. You're not where you need to be. You got to get to 10. 10% of the gross or 10% of the net? Well, do you want God to bless your gross or your net? No. It's bondage, you see? You see how it places this burden upon us? So what does this mean? It means what Paul reminds us of, that God's goal is not 10% of your money. His goal is 100% of your heart. That's what his desire is for you, especially in the area of giving. Romans 7:6, Paul writes this, but now we are released from the law, having died to that which held us captive, so that we serve in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. So what does this mean? We can chuck 10% out the window? Woo! Let's celebrate and just end there. But that's not the truth. We don't do away with the old covenant and the law of God. It serves a very important, not an important, a vital function, even in our faith and following Christ today. Paul continues, verse 7. What then shall we say? That the law is sin? By no means. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. For I would not have known what it is to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. You see what Paul's bringing out here? The law of God not only restricts sin, it reveals it. It shows the sinful condition of our heart. That's the purpose. So the tithe is incredibly valuable. That's why you'll hear us still talk about the tithe today. Not because God won't be happy with you in your giving unless you hit 10%. Guys, some of you need to reevaluate and say, Lord, do you want me to give more? But some of you have been living in bondage because you've done everything you can and rearranged your entire life and you are scraping by. Let him take whatever guilt and shame you are unnecessarily holding on to. He cares about your heart. That's what it's about, a heart of generosity. And so the law reveals sin. The 10% is still helpful and valuable because for anyone here that goes, 10%, I make a lot of money. 10% is a lot of money. I just don't know if I could do that. The law is doing its job, isn't it? It's revealing a heart potentially of materialism, of covetousness, of greed. It's revealing a heart at the very least that is not trusting in God for provision, but your paycheck. And God says you need to give so that you rely on me and properly steward that which I've entrusted to you. Verse 15, we see another area where the world's influence is rampant in our lives. In those days, I saw in Judah, Nehemiah writes, people treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in heaps of grain and loading them on donkeys. And also wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I warned them on the day when they sold food. So Nehemiah here points out, we'll pause there, but he points out how that the people of God were not observing the Sabbath. Let's talk about the Sabbath for a moment. Another area where we see the world's influence on our own lives is in the area of time. Not just money and not just our treasure here on earth, but the time that God has given to us as a gift. We complain often about how busy we are, don't we? Hey, Ryan, how you doing? Oh, man, so busy. Busy, crazy busy. So busy, you just wouldn't even understand. So busy. Good, everything's good, but so busy. Sound familiar? More often than not, those of us who are constantly talking about how busy we are and how stressful our schedule is, that busyness is self-imposed. Think about it. Someone who is genuinely so busy with life and doing what has to be done, the RN that gets off her second consecutive 24-hour shift, the guy that's sitting on the commuter bus going to his third job for the day just to make ends meet and provide for his family. These people, they don't ever talk about how busy they are. They just talk about how tired they are. Those of us who are busy, and we want everyone to know, we treat it and cloak it as a complaint, but usually it's a boast. It is covering up a sense of inadequacy and insignificance. Because if I am this busy, doing all of these things, certainly my life must matter. I have to be important, see, because if I'm not important, I wouldn't be this busy. Our full schedule covers up our empty heart. And we do so many things because we don't know who we are. Now, God has established boundaries for us in the area of time, in the area of work and labor, which are necessary. And his boundary is to keep the Sabbath. Exodus 20, verses 8 and 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven, the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Because God made the entire universe in 6 days. Yeah, but he wasn't as busy as I am. And the seventh day he set aside for rest. And he's called us to join him in that rest. Man was created on the sixth day. That means man's first full day here on earth was not spent laboring and working and caring for the garden. What was it spent doing? Resting. See, we think of rest as our relief from work, but in fact, we are called to work from a place of rest. God's desire, his boundary for us, is not to jam-pack our schedules so full that we have no time to rest. Now, legalism will make our schedules so rigid and uptight that we end up just as stressed out as we were before. The Pharisees took this commandment of the Sabbath and created 39 distinct categories of work. They said, we're not allowed to winnow. We cannot separate things. And now the winnowing means all kinds of other activities. And they added even more, hundreds and hundreds. So we cannot pull fish bones from the fish. That is winnowing. We cannot filter water because it is winnowing or separating the quality water from the impurities. That's considered work. Britta is a sinner. And all they did was place themselves in a new kind of bondage. You see the legalism? Jesus came, and in the eyes of the religious Pharisees, violated the Sabbath by picking food for him and his disciples on a Sabbath day. In verse 19, we see what some of us need to do today. As soon as it began to grow dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I, says Nehemiah, commanded that the doors should be shut and gave orders that they should not be opened until after the Sabbath. And then he stations guards at the gate. You see what he does? He says, people are coming in and doing business, working on the Sabbath. I'm going to take care of that. Before the Sabbath started, he locked all the gates, shut it down, and anybody trying to come in to do work, he said, not allowed. He guarded and protected the people of God from their own tendency to violate God's commands. Some of us need to protect God's established boundaries in our life. We need to do a better job of it, especially in the area of our time and our schedule. Take a step back and evaluate, God, what have you called me to do? God has given us all the time we need to do all that he has called us to do. Do you believe that? I hope so. If not, how cruel would that be of God? Hey, Jesus, watch this. I'm going to tell Ryan to do all these things, but he doesn't have nearly enough time. This is going to be hilarious. It's just messed up. Of course, if God says, Ryan, this is what I've called you to do, he gives us the resource and the time we need to do it. So if we don't have time to do what God has called us to do, if we don't have time to take Sabbath and to rest, what does that tell us? That we're doing things that he's never called us to do. We need to evaluate our time, our schedules, our calendars. We need to make room for margins. Guys, remember learning how to write growing up? And as a kid, you have your little lined notebook paper, so you're not writing all over the place, and they've got that little red one on the side, and you're not supposed to go past it, and you're supposed to leave room at the end. What are those borders called? They're called margins. Why are margins there? So that we don't write from top to here to down to here and just fill the entire paper. And can you imagine trying to read an essay where there's no indentation, no margin at all? It is corner to corner to corner to corner. It would be so stressful, wouldn't it? The margin brings peace. It leaves room to understand and see things with clarity, and we need to restore margins in our lives. I have in my calendar on my phone, on Fridays, a scheduled day of rest with my family. Friday is that day, and I remember I had it for a long time. I had it in my calendar, day off. And I realized I rarely took it because every time I saw it coming up, something in me just felt guilty. I don't know, a day off, I don't know if I deserve that. I've got more work to do. There's way too much to do. I can't take a day off. And the Lord convicted me to where I had to change the verbiage in my calendar. Now when you look on Friday, it says Sabbath. Not because I'm Jewish, but because I need to remind myself this is not just an optional thing if it's convenient. This is a boundary God has established for my life and for my family. What changes do we need to make in our life and in our schedule? Let me close with verse 23. Nehemiah wraps this up and gives us yet one more area we need to evaluate in our lives. He says, in those days also, I saw the Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but only the language of each people. And then he continues pointing to the example even of King Solomon and how his intermarrying with foreign women pulled him away from obedience to God. The last area of our lives, even as followers of Christ, that we can find ourselves easily infiltrated by the influence of the world and sin is in the area of relationships. Relationships. It's what life is all about. There's nothing more vital, more important. And many of us have opened ourselves up to relationships that consistently pull us away from our relationship with God. God's established boundary, we see in 2 Corinthians 6, verses 14 through 16. Paul the Apostle writes, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with what? What fellowship has light with? What accord has Christ with? I just wanted to see you pronounce that, sorry. Belial, a false god or an idol. What portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now let me jump right on legalism. Because the legalist, the religious performer will say, yes, we should not associate with sinners. It reflects poorly on us. People will think that we're sinful like them. That's what the Pharisees did. The Pharisees refused to associate with those that had a reputation for sin. Yet Jesus came and turned that whole notion on its head, didn't he? He was known as a friend of whom? Sinners. Not only did he associate with them, he would go to their house where no respectable, pure, righteous Jew would ever go. And he would walk into their home, and then he would actually sit down with them and do this incredibly intimate thing of dining with them. He would drink water with them. Jesus had incredible relationships with those no one else wanted anything to do with. However, he never yoked himself intimately with those he was ministering to. He never hung out with them and did what they did and just lived life their way because he wanted them to think that he was cool. Jesus said, no. You come to me. You are sick. I am the doctor, the physician. You come to me and you will find healing and rest for your soul. I'm not going to take my yoke and yoke your yoke and yoke myself with you. I want you to come to me and take my yoke upon you. As we interact with unbelievers and those who neither know nor fear God, our heart and motive and goal should not be to chill, hang, and let's just, be with them. The goal needs to be to yoke them with Christ. To say these people need Jesus. They are lost, bound for eternal separation from their Creator, and I have the remedy. I have the good news of who Christ is, and his yoke is available for them. Do we think this way? Do we have relationships with an intention of bringing them closer to Jesus? The question we need to ask ourselves is here, why were God's holy people comfortable marrying idol-worshiping foreigners? James 4:4, the author writes, you adulterous people, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Give you an illustration for this. Imagine if you came to me and said, Ryan, you know what? Just been thinking through this, and you seem like, a decent person, and I'd love to get to know you better. Just seem like somebody I'd want to be friends with. So what are you doing this weekend? Want to hang out? Like, oh, yeah, we can. I was going to do something with my wife, but maybe you and your wife and my wife and me, we can do a little double date thing. And your response is, we don't really like your wife. Okay, well, that's ridiculous because it would be the other way around. Everybody loves Tracy. But for the sake of the illustration, you said, we don't really like your wife. Well, what do you mean? I don't know. She just rubs us the wrong way. We don't like the way that she walks. I don't know. She just seems rude and arrogant. And I'm describing myself here, not her. She seems all of these things. So we want nothing to do with your wife, but we'd love to be your friend. What would be my response? Get out. There's a man who knows. I would hopefully be a little more gracious, but I would very emphatically say, listen, if you have a problem with my wife, then you have a problem with me. Because we have united ourselves as one flesh before God. She is me, I am her. That's how it works. There is no more intimate human relationship here. And so you need to reconcile with her in order for us to have relationship. If you're not okay with her, how can I be okay with you? How much more as we devote ourselves to Christ and give our lives to him and say we are a follower of Jesus, our creator, our redeemer, our savior, he is everything to us. There is no more intimate relationship in heaven or on earth. And yet we have this intimacy with him, but I'm perfectly okay with hanging with you and just being buddies with somebody that neither knows nor fears nor wants anything to do with him. We need to associate with this world. We need to be a friend of sinners. But our heart and our motive must be to yoke them to Christ. You see the difference? I told you this wasn't going to be a, hey, happy, happy, joy, joy kind of message today. But I hope you can join me in just letting the Spirit of God evaluate your own heart so that we are not trying to live a life that matters our own way. But we're saying, God, I want to do it your way.